Hello, I'm David Hunt, CEO and founder of Hyperion Executive Search and your host for the Leaders in Cleantech podcast. Good to have you back with us. Lately, we've been trying to explore a few different areas of technology and certainly looked at the realms of renewable heat. And this week, we're expanding into a technology which can deliver both power and heat. And it's one that's perhaps certainly underrated, perhaps misunderstood a little bit. So I'm glad we can dive into a little more around geothermal. And to do that, my guest today is Alexander Helling, who is the CEO of Baseload Capital. Alexander, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, David. And let me just add on, it's power, it's heat, but you also have cooling and mineral extraction. So geothermal can do so much. So, I love to discuss that with you.
Yeah, again, as I say, it's something that which often doesn't make the headlines. Everybody talks about wind and solar, and of course, those are fantastic and necessary. But I think people underestimate just what geothermal is, and glad that we can obviously have an opportunity to dig into that. Before we do that, Alexander, perhaps you can just share a few moments of your experience, because again, you've been, I think, with Baseload now for around 5 or 6 years, but clearly have a career before that. Perhaps you can just give us a flavour of what brought you to Baseload, and indeed why you joined the company.
Yeah, so I'm actually a co-founder of Baseload, but it started quite a long time before that, I would say. I'm from a very small place in the west part of Sweden, very close to Norway, where I grew up. And then, somehow I ended up in Shanghai when I was 22, stayed there for almost 10 years, working a lot with, everything from raising capital in equity to project finance to, debt structures and started and, still have and sold a couple of companies. And then, back when I moved back from Shanghai, I worked for a Swedish government agency working just with project finance. And, by a coincidence, one colleague reached out and said, he had this fantastic technology company startup that were, producing or had invented the technology that could convert heat into electricity in a very, very cool way. But they didn't know anything about, raising capital or how to, finance their customers. And so I joined them to support on the funding side. And that's where, the idea to Baseload Capital came. So we were visiting Iceland back in, I think, 2016, 17. And, we looked at a couple of, or I think it was 8 to 10 different wells that had, flowing water in the temperatures of around 100 to 140 degrees C, which was perfect for this technology.
Yeah.
But there were no capital and no development capabilities in place to actually utilize this fantastic resource. So that was the seed of Baseload Capital, and from that, me together with then the chairman of the technology company, we set up a business plan. How could we actually raise this capital? And then that was the foundation of Baseload Capital, and we started it in the beginning of 2018. So we're still a quite young company.
Yeah. And what's the correlation between Baseload Power and Baseload Capital? If perhaps you can give some clarity on that.
Yeah. So basically, we started off as Baseload Capital, and the idea was, as to solve that problem. How do you make sure that you have the right type of capital when developing geothermal projects? And what we realized quite sudden after that was that, there are not many developers in the countries where you have the biggest potential, such as Japan, Taiwan, even in the US, which is the biggest market for geothermal. Many of the developers were, one or two guys that had a land lease. They had done some exploration, but not that much more than that. So we realized that, we cannot invest in these developers or in these projects. We need to raise that level quite a bit, and then that's why we started our development, our Baseload Power. But to be very clear, we can still invest in projects and developers that are not owned and operated by us. So that original deal is still there.
Yeah. So let's dig into a little bit to the technology or at least the concept more broadly of geothermal, because most people would have heard of ground source heat pumps, for example. Most people know that Iceland has a lot of geothermal activity, but perhaps a lot of people don't know much beyond that. So maybe you can share a little about the range of geothermal technologies and some of its applications.
Yeah, for sure. And it's a good question. I look at the geothermal system as an ecosystem. So you can start at, basically it's, or the way I think about it at least, from low temperature to high temperature, and then everything in between, right? So, here in Sweden and Finland, you have the highest deployment rate of ground source heat pumps. I think 45% of all the villas in Sweden are connected to ground source heat pumps, which is, and most of the Swedes, they don't even know that this is geothermal, right? So which is quite fantastic. Then you have the other spectra, which is high temperatures, right? And that's where you have the big scale flash plants in New Zealand, on Iceland, in the US, in the Philippines, etc. And then you have a huge span in between there, going from, for ground source heat pumps, you need 5-6 degrees, and then you're good to go, right? Up to 300 and plus Celsius for flash plants. So in between there, you have everything from ORC systems, or binary system as you call them, where you utilize lower temperatures, and then you can use heat. So you have everything in between there. So it's better to look at geothermal from the resource, what do we have, what's available, and then what type of project can that be? Is that then is it best for a ground source heat pump, or is it best for a heating system or a cooling system, or for power production, or a combination thereof? Or are you in an area with the high mineral content, and it could also be combined, lithium extraction, silica extraction, or cesium, or what have you, right? So and I think that's one of the big problems that, why is it hard to understand what geothermal is? Because it's so many different things, and it's an ecosystem much more than, it's heat, it's electricity, or is it? No, it's all of that.
Yeah.
But it depends on the resource where you are, in what category it falls.
Yeah. Let's touch a bit, because obviously, I say the ground source heat pumps, I guess most people are broadly familiar with. We might revert back to heating and cooling, on that scale. But looking at the other end of the scale, I was on a call with Gerard Reed from Addressable Capital and a few investors recently, and we were talking about obviously solar in particular, and the sort of the energy transitions. And it seems in that conversation, and much more recently, people have started to look at geothermal from a baseload power, from a large power perspective. And it'd be good if, again, just if you can share some thoughts on that scale of how and where geothermal technologies can contribute to the energy transition on a larger scale.
Yeah, I think the amount of projects that we see now, it's growing quite rapidly. All the forecasts say that we will geothermal and hydrothermal, when you then drill down to get fluids, steam or brine to come up where you can produce electricity. It's growing, it's steadily increasing, nothing huge. What most of them are then projecting is that if we will have a breakthrough in a high temperature or a closed loop technology in somewhere, so that you can take away that you need to drill down and find fluids, that you can only utilize the heat, you would see an exponential growth of that, right? So I think there's a lot of interesting technologies being piloted right now, both in the US and abroad. I would say that we're still a couple of years away from something that is commercially viable, but if and when that happen, that is basically the holy grail for electricity production in geothermal, because you will literally take away the drilling risk, which is one of the biggest parts. And if you compare it to solar and wind, that's and a risk factor that you don't have there. There you have you have the land leases, you have the permitting, you have the grid connection, you have everything also that you have in geothermal, but you don't have the resource risk in the same way. Because in geothermal, you do need to go in and verify that resource to actually say that I have a viable project here, and there you have to spend quite a lot of money to actually validate that.
Yeah.
So that's the tricky point for standardized or traditional geothermal power production projects.
Right. Let's come back to that funding, because that's a really interesting thought that you raised there. But let's just jump back a little bit to maybe some examples, because as you say, there's still the technologies are evolving, as they always are, and we're still perhaps not at this holy grail of high temperature, high power geothermal just yet. But What are the types of applications that you're already seeing and already sort of participating in and funding? What types of projects and what sort of scale are we already seeing being deployed?
Yeah, so for us, we focus on quite standard geothermal, hydrothermal projects. So we spend a lot of time and resources on our power companies that go out. They look for the most interesting land areas. They do the exploration work. Then they drill down to verify that resource. I would say that the big difference in our mindset have gone from only looking at this as an electricity project, but rather say that let's see what type of resource it is and let the resource define if it's an electricity, a heating, cooling, or a combination of them on how we do it. So the two pilot projects we have on Iceland, for example, they are a combined electricity and then connected to the district heating network. Now we're looking to do a third one, or adding a third component to that one as well. So you would have both electricity, then district heating, and in the end you have approximately 40 degrees C left. You would utilize that for a close by like a hot spring, so that you use the full resource before re-injecting it again down into the earth. And in that way you can fully utilize all of the resource, both power production on the high temperatures, the medium and low temperatures, you use that for district heating, and the low below 40 degrees you use that for a close by onsen spa or hot spring hotel that has that today, and they have a well, but in that way we can take that over, we can manage the resource, and they are happy to buy the heat cheaper than if they produce it themselves, and for us it's a third revenue stream. So you have 3 different revenue streams then from a project, which allows us to expand into areas that previously were not economically feasible.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I'll return to that point in a second. But again, one of the things that's often misunderstood, and we all know that renewable heat is an issue, and it's one of the bigger, often the elephant in the room. It's not discussed or not understood just how much that the heat is a requirement over and above power and electricity. But on the flip side of that, of course, in a sadly very much a warming world, then cooling becomes much an issue. And again, I think a lot of people don't perhaps understand even the basic technologies behind an air source heat pump or ground source heat pump in terms of the ability to use heat to cool.
Exactly.
And again, maybe you can share some of the use cases there where we're already been able to utilize the heat from geothermal in a cooling capacity.
Yeah, no, and I think the easiest way to actually understand it is to look at ground source heat pumps, because there it's already built in, right? So in the winter months you use the delta T, the variance you have below in the earth. So if it's 10 degrees, for example, you use that, you add a little bit of electricity, and you can heat your home. In the summertime you use the reverse. So then you use the cooling temperature that is then below. You add a little bit of electricity and then you can cool it. In larger system, you can use absorption coolers, which works, a lot in the same way. You add heat, and you can then pump up the system. You can run it in a district cooling facility, for example. It's not as developed as the heating side of things, but it's definitely getting there. And as you say, with the heating or with global warmings, and it's becoming more and more, deployed. And also, how you use waste heat. Yeah. And waste heat, I think, is mainly used today for these large-scale absorption coolers, but there you can use geothermal in exactly the same way.
Yeah. Looking at, I guess, you talk about the capacities at either end of the scale, but in the middle there's a big commercial industrial need, I think, certainly for heat during manufacturing or industrial processes, but also, of course, when you look at data centers, a big need for cooling and becoming a bigger issue as we obviously as a society use more data. So, are there technologies which are of the scale for either individual or business parks, for example, where there's the ability to utilize both the heat and the power?
Yeah, for sure. And I think we're having a lot of discussions with different data centers. We're not on the scale that we can power a full data center yet, but that's our ambition to get there. And there you have it's the same. Like in many times you talk about who's the off-taker, who actually buys the electricity and who buys the heat and who buys the cooling, right? So But I think what we also will see the next 10 years is a big shift, because usually the off-takers have always been different utilities. Now, a lot of companies, they want to source the green electricity directly, both from wind, from solar, from geothermal, and the same will happen with the heat and cooling as well. And the benefit of that is, of course, that you as an electricity provider can have a direct off-taker where you don't have a utility that takes a margin on that, which means that you can get a higher profit or revenue from your project, and the buyer can actually get a lower electricity price because they don't need to pay a fee to the utility owner, right? So I think that more and more projects like that, where you will look at both electricity, heating, and cooling, will come up. I think it's going to be, or it is already, a huge demand from data centers for a renewable baseload power. And that, with the data centers that are being installed, with all the data that comes up, it's I saw some numbers that within a couple of years it will be plus 10-12% of the global electricity consumption will come from data centers, right? So they play a major fact in making sure that the electricity they use are actually renewable and sustainable, right? And that not only electricity but also for heating and cooling.
No, it's interesting. We'll swim back towards finance there, because you touched on again there. I mean, PPAs for solar in particular are fairly commonplace, but are there funding models where you can effectively do the same with the heat or the cooling, a similar kind of off-taker arrangement where you're essentially paying for in advance the service or the heating?
Yeah, for sure, and I think that's increasing in popularity, and I think especially for us, if when we build them and look at power plants or investing into projects, who is the off-taker, and it affects a lot of the revenue, right? If we can add a 10% margin because we can sell it directly to a credible off-taker, then that makes more economical sense, and we can then take that profit margin and invest that in new projects. So that will also speed up the way that we invest and that we deploy projects. And I think from in many markets, like in the US or Iceland, for example, or Europe, that is more common. If you go to Asia, where you have very little or you don't have a lot of geothermal projects, there usually the governments, they want to stimulate that, so they have feed-in tariffs, which is quite interesting. But then you have to go through the utility, and if you get that feed-in tariff, of course, that's very good for the project profitability. However, you also have to have space on the grid, because then you have to sell through either the government utility or some of the large-scale utilities in order to receive that. So you can basically say that you say no to projects with very good resources because you're only looking for that feed-in tariff. And there, if you have good corporate off-takers instead, you can still move ahead with projects where you cannot connect to the grid. So it opens up a larger area for us to invest in, and also a larger area for project developers and for our power companies to develop projects. So it's good in the way that it drives the way we work faster, and it also allows us and the industry to work in a more flexible way. And the more we see these corporate PPAs coming in, the more accepted it will be from bank, other investors, and if a lot of projects are funded and run in that way, you don't need to have the standard project finance structure where you have a AA rated utility that buys the electricity, or a utility that buys the heat. It could also be fully acceptable with the credible off-taker, and that lifts your product and makes them go faster.
Yeah. And carrying on that theme, Alexander, you touched on there, obviously, the stacking of revenue streams. And we obviously saw that in batteries, well, still now, but certainly more 5 or 6 years ago, when the technology was much more expensive. And the challenge was, how could you stack the various different revenue streams to make a viable project? And it sounds like, of course, there is maybe still the learning curve to go through geothermal in terms of the reduction of costs of the projects and the technologies. But already you're sort of looking at clever ways of financing and funding these solutions to, as you say, to bring them to fruition and not have to go through the very laborious utility kind of channels. And
no, no, exactly. No, and I think there's a lot of different ways, right? When it comes to funding of projects, then there are 1,000 different ways. But the normal way is usually that you do your exploration, you take it up to what is called a ready to build, and then you either you set the project finance facility in place, and then you develop that project. The difficult thing with a geothermal electricity project is that you need to spend a lot of capital in verifying the resource and how big the resource actually is, right? So, so how do you work and how do you mitigate that risk? Well, if you look at the learnings from the oil and gas industry, then you never put your eggs in only one basket, right? You spread them out. So by looking at and developing several projects simultaneously, you make sure that you have several projects that you can drill, after another. Then in that way you can actually de-risk that drilling quite significantly, which then allows you to raise capital easier. You get cheaper capital. You don't need to dilute that much, because usually in those early stages you're looking at different equity options, right? If you have a big enough portfolio, you can probably already at that point move in more towards a debt or hybrid solution to fund it. But the bigger the portfolio of projects that you have, the smaller or the more that you can mitigate that risk, the cheaper that capital will be. Then when you verify that resource, then you move into standardized funding structures that is available today for solar and wind. So the tricky part, I would say, for most of the geothermal developers out there is to figuring out how can I de-risk the project so much in the early phases that I can add the capital necessary to verify that resource, because after that resource is verified, then you can structure it in a classical project finance structure.
Yeah. And how about the technology? I'm assuming, obviously, from a developer's perspective, you're technology agnostic. Clearly, I think again, the wind has come down, solar has come down significantly because of the scale, essentially because of the greater capacities of manufacturing of these products. I think obviously electrolyzers are going through that path now of trying to reduce the cost by stimulating enough scale of product. What's the actual technological scene like in geothermal? Are there leaders? Is there one particular type of technology, or how does that look in the coming years?
So it's a lot of different technologies depending on what temperature that you aim at. So I would say the most, look at, on surface power generation equipment. You have the high temperature, that's steam turbines, right? And the same steam turbines are used in other power plants. So, very used everywhere. It's usually, produced by one of the big turbine manufacturers. So that technology is available. When you go down in temperature and you talk about binary or ORC equipment, then there's a handful of companies that have been in the market for 30, 40, 50 years, very good at what they do. What we're seeing also now is that a lot of new players are trying to enter that market, and also they try to enter in the lower temperature segment, around 100 degrees up to 140, which is good because this presses down the cost of the technology. We still need a lot more technology providers in the geothermal space. So, we encourage everyone that wants to get in, and this is, so a lot of things are happening. We're not seeing the same rapid decline as you have seen in solar and wind, but that's also because the industry in the power generation is still very small. Like compared to solar and wind, it's a fraction, right? So what all of us in the geothermal industry has to do is go out, showcase that this is doable, that the technology works, that the profits are there, and that you can actually de-risk these projects, because that will then in turn also bring in, if projects are profitable, then investors will see that they will start to divert money, more and more money into that field. And that will attract even more players. So you create a positive spiral new companies starting, new investors coming in, and then new players entering the industry. And we have seen that the last 5 years that this is happening. It's still on a very early stage. So I would say that right now is a very good timing to get into the geothermal industry. It do, however, takes you have to spend a lot of energy on understanding the different risks, and also educate your partners and your investors of what those risks are, so that they can also take part in mitigating them, because that's the way. Because you don't want to end up with your first project being failed, and then you cannot raise any more money, you cannot pay your suppliers and so on. So you need to have you need to be long term. You need to structure it in the right way, and also think about how that business model will look like.
Yeah. And on that, looking at the ecosystem of entrepreneurs and people to create or take forward these technologies. I'm mentoring at the moment. I think we touched on an email. A company at the moment who have a technology to repurpose wells towards geothermal. But where for entrepreneurs perhaps listening and looking at geothermal as a good future opportunity, what sort of areas do you think there are gaps for entrepreneurs to perhaps find a solution, or whether it's a business model or a technology that can further the geothermal speed of take up, if you like?
Yeah. I would say that basically all parts of the geothermal ecosystem is still it's a huge potential. It's the industry is still so small. Even when it comes to geothermal heat pumps, it's small. It's very well built out in Northern Europe, but the rest of Europe, large parts of Northern America, and then North Asia, it's you have huge opportunities. So I would look at what am I good at? Am I a developer? Am I good at drilling wells? If I come from the oil and gas industry, for example, what part would I like to do then? Because in all the segments in the geothermal industry, except maybe from the really high temperature flash plant part, I would say there's a lot of good opportunities. So if you take an example in Eastern Europe, most of the heating comes from gas, and that could quickly be converted into ground source heat pumps, or it takes more of investments, but to district heating based on geothermal. If you start with the heating and you find the right temperatures, you can then add on electricity as well, and a large part of all of Eastern Europe could be definitely heated, but also powered by geothermal. And you have this I would say all the continents in different forms. If you're on the tectonic plates, then electricity production combined with heating, for example, or only electricity production, still has a huge potential, especially if you go down a little bit in temperatures. In the northern hemisphere, heating is super interesting. And we talked about Iceland, and many think that Iceland is completely powered by geothermal. It's actually 80% powered by hydro, and then 20% powered by geothermal. However, the heating in Iceland is 99% heated by geothermal.
Yeah.
It's the heating part that's also the biggest geothermal consumer on Iceland, that you usually think is the main source of power production, and it's a big one, but it's not the major one.
Yeah. So looking at addressable markets, then clearly as an entrepreneur investor, you start to look at what is the addressable market for a given technology. And we've touched on there are some areas geographically where Iceland, Japan, we've touched on briefly, where I guess things are more advanced or there's a more obvious source of power. But looking across Europe, and the UK is sadly where it's behind in many things, but not least of which district heating. But obviously other parts of Europe and the Northern Hemisphere, district heating is still more of a thing, which again would maybe be easier to tap into. So are there, I don't know, cold spot as much as there are hot spots, geographically where the technology couldn't or isn't necessarily a good fit?
No, well, like Sweden and Finland is probably the worst place when it comes to power production for geothermal, right? Because you need to drill so deep in order to reach that heat. There are some interesting, drilling technologies that, might allow that in the future, but we'll see when that comes. But Northern Europe, so Sweden, Norway, Finland, we're sitting on 5 kilometers of granite rock, and then after those 5, you still need to go quite deep before you get heating that could be used for electricity production, and to get that up to the surface and so. So this is probably the worst spot globally to look for geothermal for power production. However, as we talked about, for heating and cooling, it's perfect with geothermal heat pumps. If you go the Americas and you start up in Alaska all the way down to Chile and Argentina, that's where you have the tectonic plates, right? So there it's very good areas for power production. Many of the areas you can also combine that with heat, so that's definitely a hotspot. And then you have the traditional ones. But the traditional ones, I think this is interesting, right? Because if you look at the potential to find these really, really high temperature fields where you have 300 degrees plus, they still exist and are not developed, but they're much harder to identify. But if you go down in temperature and you say that, okay, so I'm looking at 100 up to 200 or 250 degrees, then there's still massive amounts of projects available. They are smaller. You're going to have to be much more careful in making sure that you can actually get the returns. In some of the countries, you don't have the supply chain so that you can bring down the cost to actually make them economically viable now. So there you have to look at different business model, or you have to get team up with other project developers so that you can procure all the drilling, the material at the same time, so you can get the cost down. So you have to be creative in looking at how can we make these projects fly. But the potential there is big, and then always looking at what can the resource provide. Is it an electricity project? Is it a heating, or what is the resource fit for?
Yeah. So sometimes those complexities can put people off, but equally for those who are able to see through, the ability to, as you've clearly done, use some forms of traditional finance to create business models which make actually de-risk or make projects more quickly viable. From a technology point of view and an industry point of view, clearly we want to transition as many people, both talents and businesses, from those dirtier areas to more cleaner. It seems, and you've touched on this already, that there are some obvious possibilities to transition both technology and people from the oil and gas sector towards geothermal. Are you starting to see that?
Oh yeah, for sure. And we see a big interest. We also have built our own cap table based on where do we find, or where do we have our gaps. How do we identify resources subsurface? How do we extract those resources? And the best companies in that field, they come from the oil and gas industry. Like just last year, you had 200 wells drilled for geothermal electricity production globally. You had more than 79,000 oil and gas wells drilled. Right. So if you just look at it, we're such a small fraction. Right? Yeah. And if you look at the knowledge, the R&D, the money that goes in to drilling 79,000 wells a year, if you can transform that into geothermal, that's when you will see the big needle change, right? We can play an important role, but we can also, as I see it, if we show that this is possible, we show that this is scalable, that you can mitigate that risk. If we can influence the oil and gas industry to move into geothermal instead, I think that's where we can really switch the needle and get traction in this, because it's such a big difference. And just the resources going into R&D, how do you map a resource? How do you make sure it's sustainable? How do you enhance it? How do you develop these closed loop systems? That would all already be in place if only a fraction of the amount of money that goes into R&D in oil and gas went into geothermal instead. But there you have the knowledge, right? So you have it, and it's not the same. Of course, there's a difference in extracting geothermal brine or steam from a resource than it is extracting oil and gas. However, that the fundamentals in how you get there, how you manage it, and how you how you can utilize the knowledge to develop it further, that exists. And we see that we have there's a bunch of, especially in the US, a bunch of different conferences and initiatives, to teach people in the oil and gas industry that are interested in geothermal, about geothermal and the industry, and that those have been growing rapidly the last 5 years, and we see when we recruit people, we get a lot of interest from people working at the big oil and gas and service companies, which is super positive, right? Because they come with a lot of knowledge, and then we need to use that in a good way.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We find at Hyperion, of course, there's a lot of people who want to transition their skills into a more impactful or environment, and a lot of those courses come from traditional automotive, but also a lot from oil and gas. And it's good to see that there's a more obvious fit. Clearly, as you say, they're not the same, but a lot of those skills, there's clearly a lot of super smart people in that sector, and as you say already, an awful lot of money and sunk costs to some extent in the learning and operation of these wells that we hopefully can then, as you say, provide the appetite for people to make that transition, both as businesses and as individuals.
Yes. Yeah, no, totally. And I think, back to the question or the dialogue we had about, closed loop systems, we see a couple of the companies that are really focusing on these closed loop systems. They all have their history within oil and gas, and they are doing, pilot projects right now. And if that succeeds and if commercialized, then you take away the risk that you have to identify these fault systems where you have fluids coming up. You can only look for heat, which is very well mapped globally, and then it's a question of can we get the cost down so it becomes economically viable, so that we can deploy the new technology without a lot of subsidies, and that's the long-term target, right? And it can be here, in a couple of years, or it might take 5 to 10 years. But when that happens, I think that's when we really can see, a big scale up of large-scale, power production in geothermal. And I think up until that, the scalability in geothermal will come from heat.
Right.
There's a lot of electricity projects going on as well, and it's increasing. But but my belief is that will the scale up in heat will also allow a lot more electricity projects. But that's where we're going to see a rapid increase first, and that will be followed then with a rapid increase in more electricity projects. Because then the heating is also a part. It has lower risk right now, which is then easier to attract investors. If you get a lot of investors coming in, understanding that part of the geothermal system, they will also learn about the other parts of geothermal, which makes it more makes it easier for them to then take a bit higher risk in the next stage, which is then electricity projects.
Yeah. Well, risk is all, obviously, is in some from an investment and from a developer's perspective, and as you say, so quite often it's those smaller steps where you can start to show the viability of technologies and just slowly de-risk and make more known and make more understood the technologies. You've kind of alluded to it there a little bit there, Alexander, but I was going to ask if, obviously you've been doing this now with Baseload for 5 or 6 years. How do you see, or what would you like to see in the next 5 or 6 years? Where do you anticipate we'll be by that point?
I think that we have seen a massive scale up in heating projects, especially in Europe and North America. I think that at that time we probably have a couple of commercialized closed loop system for electricity production. They might at that point not yet be economically sustainable, but the technology on how to do it will definitely be there. And then it's a question on how can that one be deployed or scaled up so that you see the same decrease in cost as you see it in solar and wind, because that's a question of scale, right? So then you need, and when that comes, you need a lot of project developers that are sitting on land leases, that have the grid connection, that have the capital to invest, and the more of those projects that are ready to deploy this technology, the faster it will become economically sustainable. So that's what I see. So I think that Asia especially Japan, Taiwan, Indonesia is already there today, and the Philippines as well. But they will have started to produce from lower temperatures, as well as I think most of these countries will also look at how can we utilize cooling from these resources in a different way also.
Yeah. I think that, as you say, is trying to find the opportunities and the low-hanging fruit, so to speak, where you can start to get these scale. And I think, as we've already touched on, and the ability to generate both heat and cooling certainly seems to be perhaps some of the more easier types of projects, and certainly ones where we start to build that traction and start to, as you say, get that scalability. So it would be good to see more of those happening.
Well, and then, just to add on also, David, I think what we will also see is a lot of combined projects. Like if you take geothermal electricity plant, for example, then you have the heating source, but then you cool that to get the delta T so that you can produce electricity, right? So during daytime, you will have your cooling towers will work much harder, which means that you will have a decrease in electricity output during the day. So combine geothermal with solar projects, for example, because the curves are it's perfectly aligned. So I think that we will see more of that. I think that we will see more projects that sell electricity and heat and cool directly to companies, taking away the utility or building small IPPs. I think that will allow the industry also to move much faster. And I think investors right now are, they are starting to become used that also from solar and wind projects where, you install a big, solar power plant on top of an industry and then you sell it directly to the industry. So the investors are getting more and more used to this. So they will be more inclined to do that even for geothermal, which is good, because if they learn how that works in solar and wind and with battery storage, and then moving that same knowledge into geothermal and also supporting the geothermal developers and projects on how can you make this even more profitable if you do it in this way and that way, that will speed up the whole scale up in the industry.
Yeah, no, it's beautiful when part of the clean energy sector leverages and supports the growth of others, and this hybridization or co-location of technologies clearly is a great way to do that. Listen, we've spoken for a while, and I appreciate your efforts. So that we could go on forever because it's such a genuinely fascinating topic. But I appreciate the insights so far. We'll of course leave on the episode page links to Baseload Capital, Baseload Power, so people can perhaps do some more researches into the topic. But for now, Alexander, thanks very much for sharing your experience.
Thank you so much for having me, David.